Overwatch is a good game. If I were to call it anything less, you could tell immediately that I was just being contrarian and blowing smoke in various orifices. But it's certainly not a great game by any stretch of the imagination. Sadly, it's kind of clear what would have made Overwatch a great game to the point of it's something that you could conceivably see Blizzard doing to have made it a great game. However, it may be too little too late for that. The best way to understand what would have made Overwatch a great game is to think about what made it a good game. Now, a lot of people get very upset when you bring up the fact that Overwatch is very overtly a chimera of other video games. Simply put, somebody in the development house decided it would be a good idea to take all the good parts of other video games that people like and make a sort of super game out of them. And at least initially, it seemed to have worked. Unfortunately for Blizzard, it seemed as the months rolled by, people were getting more and more sick of their creation. If we look at each individual factor or influencer for Overwatch, we can figure out that they got the surface level thing right, and they did a really good job of implementing it. But the stuff that goes on beyond the surface that makes each of Overwatch's influencers work the way it does is what the development team missed out on. And without those vital under the hood things, it kind of falls apart. The first major influencer on Overwatch is pretty obvious once you finally figure it out, and if you're like me, you'll feel pretty stupid that you hadn't figured it out earlier. Overwatch bears the influence of a lot of Blizzard's previous body of work, which, why on earth wouldn't it? Blizzard's been at the game-making business for decades, and it wouldn't make sense not to take all the things that have worked in previous games and put them in Overwatch. Some of these things aren't even really exclusive to the game industry, but are just best practices for anything that involves any sort of animation or art design. For instance, every character has a unique sound, footstep, and silhouette, which is partly a thing primarily used in the creation of cartoons and animation, but still is a very good idea for a video game, and we can see what happens to other games when they kind of look all samey. You're never going to mistake a Widow for a Symmetra at sniping distance. Perhaps what Blizzard does best of all for their games is not the games themselves, but the amazing, professional studio-level cinematics that they give for each of their games and multiple times to help you get acquainted with each character. Through these cinematics, you can figure out what kind of a person the character is, what they do, how they play, what their motivations are, and you can even get a feeling of sympathy for the characters that are supposed to be evil. Now, compare this to, say, another game studio cinematics, and all I can really get is, well, they're certainly doing some cool fighting stuff in a forest, and somebody mentioned a place called Naxia. That's cool, I guess. These cinematics are so good at doing what they need to do that they eventually become a hindrance later on, but we'll talk about that in the next part of this video. For now, though, we need to talk about what Blizzard neglected to do when it came to using their previous body of work to influence Overwatch. Now, in case you didn't know, Blizzard did not invent the hero shooter genre. In fact, if we're counting mods, hero shooters have been around for near on a decade. Back in the day, I used to play a lot of Counter-Strike Source as a youth, and there was this lovely mod, aptly enough named the Warcraft mod. I particularly liked Warcraft Surf or Warcraft Zombies, but it was always the Warcraft mod that made me come. Warcraft mod was pretty much a hero shooter. You picked whatever class or hero that you wanted to be, often names like Orc Warlock or the Vagabond, and you would level up and eventually get new abilities that you could use in a first-person shooter setting. Warcraft mod even had ultimates that you had to bind to your keys in order to make them work. Now, why is this important? Well, it proves that there's a bit of an idea of what to work on when it comes to the genre of hero shooter, but Blizzard doesn't work like that. If you look at all of Blizzard's previous works, you'll notice that they all came around when the genre they're in was established, because Warcraft, the original ones, certainly weren't one of the first RTS games. World of Warcraft was certainly not the first MMO by a long shot, and while technically Dota did begin as a Warcraft 3 mod, Heroes of the Storm didn't come out until a decade after MOBAs were considered a thing. Blizzard is not a pioneering studio, they are a perfecting studio. They wait for all the groundwork to be laid, and then they do what they do best. They make everything as perfect as it can be, and then they release their installation into the series. Hero shooters were at best in the pioneering phase of what they were. Aside from maybe that one particular Warcraft mod on Counter-Strike and maybe a few other things, nobody was really doing them or knew how to approach them. So Blizzard didn't have a blueprint to work off when they were making Overwatch and had to borrow heavily from other genres to realize their vision. And while taking the good parts of other games to make a super game isn't necessarily a bad thing in the slightest, it does lead you to make mistakes later on because you don't have a clear framework to go on. After Blizzard applied what it could and tried to fill in the blanks with whatever else they could find later, we can see the next major influence of Overwatch, which is Team Fortress 2. I could use a lot of other games here as the example, but Team Fortress 2 is the best class-based, objective-defined shooter that really fits the bill for a direct influence to Overwatch. The maps are asymmetrical but have a lot of replayability, and you're often doing some objective like pushing a cart, taking over a control point or something that does have a meaning in the expanded universe of the game, but right now all we're really concerned with is getting on that point. All the heroes fall into a specific class that outlines what they do, very similar to how the heavy weapons guy is literally called just that, the heavy weapons guy. And each hero has a mainstay weapon that has a primary and secondary function that pretty much defines how you're going to play them. Another thing that Overwatch did, that Team Fortress 2 did right, which some people don't know about, is the 6v6 format, which they did get right whole cloth. 6v6 was just the right size to where you had enough players to rely on a team, but you didn't have so few players that it can be traced to one person if they won or lost, which was the competitive format for Team Fortress 2, which you may not have heard about because not a lot of people participated. If we focus on these facets alone, Blizzard did an amazing job of taking the good part of Team Fortress 2 and putting it into a new game with other features from other games. But if we look at the other underlying things that Valve did to make Team Fortress 2 a great game, which is certainly not loot crates, we see that Overwatch forgot one of the most important parts of Team Fortress 2 when making Overwatch. So again, back in the day, we little charlatan got the orange box for Christmas. And boy, did I play a lot of Team Fortress 2. After pretty much inhaling the Half-Life 2 episodes and Portal, I almost exclusively played Team Fortress 2 until Left 4 Dead came out. And one thing I remember, or perhaps I should say I don't remember, from the years of playing that game is there was never a massive balance pass. There were never major bludgeonings from the nerf bat on any particular character. Yes, new weapons got introduced, but there was never any real need to download a test server to try out what the characters are gonna be like in a few months. For the most part, all the new weapons were side grades, and you really didn't need to worry about them breaking the game. Everything was good. This rock-solid balancing is what Blizzard forgot to bring in from Team Fortress 2, which makes the class-based gameplay tiring at times. Now, if you remember how I said that those amazing cinematics eventually came back to hurt Blizzard, well, here it is. Because it was seemingly that they were swinging around the nerf bat on a drunken fever, people got really upset more so than they would, because these cinematics were so good that a lot of players felt a serious connection to the characters, and seeing these characters being radically changed by an outside force, maybe to some of them was like having a friend you know suddenly being forced to change because of a parent or a significant other. And nobody likes that. So people who would have already gotten upset got extra upset, and we all know how a lot of game player bases get when they get upset. I'm not condoning this, I'm not saying it's okay, but this is certainly what happened. I remember one of the reasons why I stopped playing a lot of Overwatch was because over the first few months, people went from really cool to just absolutely toxic, like poison control levels of venomous. Suffice it to say though, if you're completely reworking characters like Symmetra within the first 6 months of your game going live, you didn't finish your game. You needed a lot more balancing, and you forgot that. If anything, class-based shooters like Team Fortress 2 or even games like Quake show how absolutely essential it is to have perfect, or if not very, very good balancing right out the gate if you want to have class-based gameplay. Now, before we move on into the third and final major influence on Overwatch, which is pretty obvious at this point, I'm going to touch on something that kind of goes over all the influences, but none of them at the same time, which is the fact that you can't say that Overwatch took their ideas for characters, heroes, etc. from anyone in particular. Well, yes, Roadhog is very, very obviously similar to, say, Pudge, Patches, or whatever the League of Legends equivalent of him is. These are character designs that have been around for well over a decade. You can't claim ownership of a trope. All these characters, while functionally are very similar, like say, Pharah, the rocket-based assault type that very much relies on mobility, which can be derived from their rockets, but you can't say that you own rocket jumping guy, or in this case, girl. As far as classes and characterizations go, it's not the mechanics and basic framework of the character that matters. It's the characterization and how you display those tropes and abilities. And that is something that is definitely in Blizzard's repertoire. They have some of the most memorable, iconic video game characters ever, and Overwatch is definitely not an exception to that. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the influence of MOBA, hero type, whatever you want to call them, games on Overwatch. This bit goes hand in hand with the Team Fortress 2-esque style of play, where they still have all the primary and secondary weapon features. All characters have somewhere between 3 to maybe 5 abilities, one of which will always be an ultimate, just like in hero brawlers, ARTS, whatever you want to call them. Dota games, let's say from now on. So, how is that different from the Dota games? Well, Overwatch does a smart thing and just gives you all your abilities right off the bat, where you don't have to spend the first 20 minutes of each map grinding it out in the lanes in the jungle. You have everything from the get-go, even though some of those abilities need charging. And that's the other great thing. Your ultimate charges as fast and as aggressively as you play. You can, if you really wanted to, just sit in the back and idle, and eventually you'll get an ultimate off. Or you can get right into the thick of things doing what your character does best, and just get an ultimate within the first minute of the game. On the surface level, this is a great idea and a great way to shake up shooters, but an issue arises in the meta. Let's look at a couple other games that have the same sort of abilities ultimate setup for their characters. Dota 2, at launch, not that weird hokey pokey where you had like 50 keys for the game in your inventory, but actual launch had just over 100 heroes. And currently, Dota 2 sits at 115. League of Legends, while taking a long time to get there, is currently at 134 heroes, but back in the day it started out at just 40, which it got the job done at the time. So how many heroes does Overwatch have? 26. It launched at 21. This becomes a problem because you have so few heroes for this type of ability that you inevitably see the meta stagnate very quickly, which is especially prevalent in the kinda sort of competitive scene that at the very least Blizzard is pushing, but I really don't see very many clandestine Overwatch tournaments these days, or when it came out. So, how did they fix this? Well, isn't it convenient that they had a lot of unbalanced characters and the nerf back got swung around quite a bit? Well, the constant buffing, nerfing, and even complete reworking of characters did help shake up the quickly stagnating meta. It did nothing for the previously mentioned problem about how personally people took it when their characters were radically altered. In fact, it made it worse because there were so few characters that people very easily and very quickly took notice of when one was changed because there were just so few to go around, and if you only had 1 or 2 characters you liked to play and one of them got radically changed, you were kind of out of luck. Another thing that the sparseness of characters really hurt was that whenever Blizzard started to introduce a new hero, they were met with lukewarm reception at best and outright mockery at worst. And we all remember a certain something that I'm not going to touch on in this video because after doing my research I realized that this deserves to be a video all by itself. It wouldn't be such a major spotlight issue every time a new hero got released in anything less than perfect balance, or when an existing hero got radically changed if there was, say, 40 or even 50 heroes at launch. That way, if, say, your main hero got sidelined for a bit due to some heavy-handed Nerf bat wielding, you would probably have at least 4 or 5 other fallbacks that you could play in the meantime. So we've established the 3 major pillars of Overwatch and what they took from these pillars, and what they neglected to take, which caused a bit of a problem. Now, if we look at each of these things individually, it seems like something that's kind of reasonable to suggest, and maybe you could do it. However, if we take all 3 of these major pillars and what they didn't bring to the table when they made Overwatch out of them, we start to see just how crazy an undertaking it would be to make Overwatch a great game. While yes, having twice the amount of heroes on its own could be a reasonable thing if you took a year to do, then you have to consider the immaculate balancing. You're no longer taking all that time to balance the 25, 26 characters that you have, you're balancing 50 characters, which makes it an entirely more monumental task. Then we multiply those 2 by Blizzard waiting or having to find someone else that has made an established framework for the hero shooter genre, and we're suddenly looking at Overwatch needing an extra 5, maybe 10 years before it sees the light of day. If we take absolutely everything said in this video, we still, in spite of everything mentioned here, cannot deny that Overwatch is a very good game. However, we cannot say it is a great game. A good game, and even a very good game, is considered that because it has so many benefits and pluses that it outweighs the setbacks and the minuses. A great game, however, is something that just is. There are no pros and cons to consider, it's just a great game. And this could have been Overwatch, but alas, well, the task to make Overwatch that great game was Herculean. The attempt to make it was more like Icarus. Blizzard got too ambitious, flew too close to the sun, but landed on piles and piles of money from the loot boxes. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you liked the video, be sure to tell me what you liked, or if you think I'm full of garbage, go ahead and tell me in the comments. I don't mind. I like discourse. Now, be sure to subscribe and hit that little notification bell, since I do try to make my videos at least once a month, but it's not quite a perfectly consistent basis, as I've got a lot of life stuff going on, and sometimes you can't exactly hit that 1 month by 1 month basis, but sometimes you can get 2 done in 1 month, which was the case last month. Either way, I'll be glad to have you. If you really want to help me make more of these videos, and maybe even do this full time, please consider supporting my Patreon.